Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Unstoppable Dad Project. Appreciate you joining me here for another week. While I've got you, before I get into today's topic, please make sure that you're subscribed on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. If you're able to, jump on and leave us a 5-star review. By you doing that, subscribing, leaving us a review, and also sharing it around with anybody that you might think will get some value out of what it is that we're doing here, that will continue to help me grow the podcast and continue to allow me to put the time, energy, and effort into releasing a new episode each week for you. So thank you to all of those who have supported the podcast up until this point. I am forever grateful to you and for the messages of support, for the sharing of the episodes, and for everything else that you do for us every single week. So hopefully I can continue to do the podcast and provide some great value for you. This week, I want to talk about mastering the basics. And the reason I'm going to talk about this topic this week is because when it comes to training, and it comes to training programs, a lot of people want to seek a training program that is new and novel all the time. There are no repeated days. It is always there's always something new happening. We're always doing new movements, and we're always moving forward on something else that we've never done before. Now, the problem with that is when it comes to training, to be brutally honest, most people are beginners. They're still in that beginning stage of training. And there are, if we were to look at beginner, intermediate, and advanced trainers, like people who are in their training life cycle, there are probably very, very few people in the world who I would truly consider to be advanced. There will be a bunch of people that are intermediate, and there will be the vast majority of the population who are in the beginning stages of training. And the problem with trying to jump to the problem with a new and novel program where you're doing movements new all the time and you're doing everything is brand new every time you step into the gym is you're never going to get good at the basics. In fact, a good beginner program is actually fairly boring. There is a lot of repetition in the movements that you're doing. You will generally do the same movements week in, week out for many, many weeks on end. And you will incrementally increase and progressively load those movements to a point where you're able to achieve a good level of proficiency in those movements. Now, that is the pursuit of mastering the basics. And when you jump around and you don't repeat movements and you don't redo them, you're not ever able to achieve this proficiency or this mastery in a good period of time. It will take you a long, long time to get there. And the problem with that is, if you're jumping around in the early stages of your athletic development or the early stages of your training, or this principle can really be applied across the board into a broad spectrum of things in life, whether it be sport, whether it be business. It really just comes down to making sure when you're starting out that you are in this constant pursuit of trying to master the basics. Now, for me personally, I think true mastery is unachievable. True mastery to me is when you know every single thing about the subject matter, or you're able to do a movement perfectly. And perfection in life in a lot of areas is just simply unachievable. And so mastery itself is unachievable, but mastery, especially when it comes to the basics, is something that we should constantly be aiming for, that we should constantly be working towards. And regardless of whatever the pursuit is, whether it's training or business or sport like jiu-jitsu, is one where you want to make sure that you are working towards mastering the basics before you really try and get more complex, is that if you don't spend that time mastering the basics, you're not going to have a solid base to build your long-term progression onto. And what I mean by that is if we take it back to training, and let's say we are trying to build a pyramid, or we're trying to build any form of structure. The wider the base is, generally the higher the structure can go. And if we imagine things like our primal movement patterns, squat, step, lunge, press, pull, push, pull, upper and lower body, things that a lot of good programs are based on, mine included, just to put in a little bit of a shout out there. They're the basics. They're the things that need to be mastered. They are the base of the pyramid. And if you're spending the time mastering those movements, and you've spent the time in the trenches doing the repetitions to get uncommonly good at those movements, then it means that you have the ability to build that pyramid quite high. Whereas if you haven't built that base and that nice wide base, and then you start adding in complex movements, you start trying to do things like high level calisthenics, Olympic weightlifting, like all these things without building that base, then at some point, the more complex you make things and the higher you try and make that structure, it is going to fall down in some point. When it comes to injury, that will generally result, when it comes to training, that will generally result in potentially some form of injury. It may result in mental burnout because you haven't got that base level of movement down before you're trying to add more complex, more athletic movements in. And as a result, there's no level of enjoyment when you try and push your body to a more complex or a more advanced point. So we need to make sure that we are spending that time to master the basics. And the fact is, the time that it actually takes to get good at those is generally a lot longer than what people think. It is generally not just a 3 to 6 month undertaking. It can take 12 months, 2 years, 3 years of consistently doing those things 3 times a week every time you step into the gym. Now, don't get me wrong, there are ways a good coach, when it comes to movement and it comes to training and it comes to programming, can reposition those, do different variations of those movements to try and allow you to still get good at those movements, because we are still doing those movement patterns. We are still building that base. We are still looking to achieve mastery on those basics, where we can still change the structure of the way we do things, variations, different loading styles, things like that, where we can give that variation. But the thing is, the common thread there is we're still looping back to those same basics over and over again. And a lot of people quit on the basics because they think they get, and I'm super guilty of this with a lot of areas of my life, where I get shiny object syndrome, where I see something and I'm like, oh, that seems better than what I'm doing now. And every time I do that, if I haven't spent the time working on the basics and I try and jump off to something more advanced because I think it's going to be better for me, or my mind is like, I'm bored with this, I'm moving over here. Every time, the thing that I move towards doesn't work out because I haven't put the appropriate time into the basic thing that I really need to do. And for me, that's where coaches have come in really handy to get you refocused, to move you back to the basics. But the basics take longer than most people think. With training, if progress is still happening, i.e. if you're doing like a starting strength style training program where you're doing 3x5, squat, deadlift, press, maybe some pull-ups, things like that, and you're still progressing. The weight on the bar is still moving. Your movement quality is getting better. Your range of motion is improving. All these things are adaptations that are happening as a result of that commitment to try and master those basic movements. And if there's progress still happening, you probably don't need to change. You probably don't need to move to a different program because the program that you're doing is still yielding the result that you're looking for. Now, we can get into a conversation about making sure that you have clearly defined to yourself and whoever it is that you're working with about the result that you're trying to get to. But if progress is still happening, you probably still need to stay on that basic program. And again, to loop back, most people jump off basic programs because they get bored with it and they think that their progress is stalled when it really hasn't. We've got to look at the time frame that progress has happened over. If it's that you haven't hit a PR in a session, maybe we've got to adjust that perspective out a little bit to maybe a month, maybe 2, maybe 3, depending on your training age. But a lot of the times people will jump from thing to thing and they won't get any progress because they haven't spent the time mastering the basics. And once you have mastered the basics, or you have gotten to a point with those basics that you are doing them uncommonly well, then you can start to layer in complexity. And when I say layer in complexity, it doesn't mean, it means understanding the steps it's going to take. If you need to, let's say for example, if you want to do a muscle up, but you can't even do a pull up, we need to get to the point where we're doing a pull up first. And then from there, when you do a pull up, we need to look at the layers of where you're at with that pull-up. Like, are you able to pull your chest to the bar with the pull-up? That is layering in complexity. It is not as, I can just get my chin over the bar, now I'm going to go to a muscle-up. That is not layering in complexity. That's still adding in complexity, but layering it in is understanding what the next appropriate step is. Because if we use the pyramid analogy, if we were to, let's say we had 5 blocks on the pyramid. And for those of you that are watching on YouTube, you'll see that I'm doing the hand gestures. But those of you that are listening, just imagine you've got 5 blocks from a pyramid. They go from the widest being the base, which is the basics. And then there's one which is, it moves up the pyramid if we were to build the pyramid properly. And it goes all the way to the tip at the top. And the tip at the top may be the muscle up. And if you go from putting the base there, and then you take the tip, which is the muscle up, and put it straight on the base, and then you try and build onto that next block, you're not going to be able to because you haven't layered in that next step. Whereas we want to make that pyramid as high as possible. So if we layer in those appropriate steps and we don't miss a step and we don't shortcut it, it means that we're able to continue progressing long term without injuring ourselves, without sacrificing the long-term success for that short-term payoff. And a lot of the time when people are looking to jump around or people aren't willing to put in the time for the basics, what it comes down to is it's that short-term satisfaction that they are trading in their long-term progression for. So we need to make sure that when we're looking to do this, we are spending enough time in mastering those basics. It doesn't matter whether it is training, it doesn't matter whether it is business, it doesn't matter whether it's a sporting endeavor like jiu-jitsu or something like that. If you try and add in complexity too early without spending the time, the reps in the trenches looking to master those basics, it is going to lead to trouble, and much worse, you are going to sacrifice your long-term progression as a result of it. One thing that I have tried to do in my life when I have identified that pattern of behavior in myself is circle back to the basics and really try and work on finding joy in getting better at those things. So let's say, for example, it is something like a squat. finding joy in getting a better range of motion, finding joy in maybe able to getting a little bit lower in a squat, maybe able to looking to add more weight, and looking at how the time frame that I'm doing that on. So I'm trying to progress this in a 6-month window rather than trying to progress it week to week. That's from a training point of view. But finding joy in doing those things really well and being really, really good at the basics has been something that has really helped me just focus on that. And then in turn from that, setting up weekly and daily goals around those things that I need to do in order to continue to be in this pursuit of mastery for the basic tasks or the basic movements that I need to do from a training, from a business point of view. And that is, it's a hard thing to quantify because there's almost no quantification of it for some people. When you get a little bit more advanced with your training, you get a little bit older, you get into a later stage of your business. The basics can be hard to quantify when you get to a particular point of progress in that. But it's almost a joy in just doing it, knowing that I am constantly circling back to these basics. Even though I am doing more advanced things, I'm constantly circling back to doing these movements and finding the joy in that, finding the joy in the fact that I've spent so much time getting good at these things and I can still continue to do that. That has really helped me try and ward off the shiny object syndrome where I need to jump up to a different stage in the pyramid that I'm trying to layer on. So everyone's on their own path, right? But sometimes it's a really good thing for us if we're feeling very overwhelmed by the world and we're feeling very overwhelmed by the process of training, just to circle back to the basics and just start with that. You may have trained for 10, 15, 20 years, and then all of a sudden there's been a drop off over the last whatever years there are due to kids and work and life, and those things happen. But I think what happens is a lot of people will then go and they'll compare themselves to a previous point in their life and think that they need to be back there. When what probably needs to happen, if you've had a prolonged time off, allow yourself to be treated as a beginner again. And circle back to those basics and then try and get back to the point where you're doing those things uncommonly well. And then you can start look at adding in and layering in that complexity. But don't be too quick to progress. Understand that if we're talking from a training point of view, sometimes the best training programs will look boring. And we need to find a way where we inherently find joy in doing those things uncommonly well. And we are in this constant pursuit to trying to master the basics before we start to get too complex, blocking out the noise and understanding that we're on our own journey and our own path. Make sure once you have those basics mastered or you are doing them uncommonly well, you want to just build on them. You don't want to deviate from them, because if you have gotten good results from doing that, you will be able to continue to get good results by just building and layering onto those. So let me know if it's something that you've struggled with, kind of jumping around, or this want to jump around. And maybe when you've struggled with things, you've struggled with injury, constantly getting injured in the gym, etc., 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 maybe you've jumped away from the basics too quickly and you haven't spent the appropriate time in the trenches doing it. But let me know if you know inherently whether you do spend enough time on those or you don't. Because I think it's a very, very important thing to make sure that we do at any stage in life, regardless of how long we've been doing things, we need to make sure we're still in that pursuit to try and master those basics. So thanks for listening. You can follow us on the social medias at The Unstoppable Dad on Instagram, The Unstoppable Dad Project on Facebook. And again, please make sure you're subscribed on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. Jump on, leave us a 5-star review, and share this around. Thanks very much for your time. I appreciate you listening as always. Have a great week. Bye.